I'll get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, especially for taking time out of your weekend. So if you haven't joined us before, READ is a collaboration between Champaign-Urbana area public and academic libraries that seek to promote racial literacy and discussion and to encourage anti-racist activism and self-reflection. So I'm going to take a moment to introduce our wonderful panel. Today we have Dr. Charlene J. Fletcher, who is the postdoctoral research associate in slavery and justice at Brown University and a historian specializing in 19th century United States and African American history and gender studies. Prior to attending Indiana University, sorry, something just popped up on my computer. Prior to attending IU, Charlene led domestic violence sexual assault program, as well as a large reentry initiative in New York City, assisting women and men in their transition from incarceration to society, and served as a lecturer of criminal justice at LaGuardia Community College. Charlene's research and forthcoming book explores the experiences of confined African-American women in Kentucky from Reconstruction to the Progressive Era, specifically illuminating the lives of confined Black women by examining places other than carceral locales and arenas for confinement, including mental health institutions and domestic spaces. She seeks to explore how these women both defied and defined confinement through their incarceration, interactions with public, social, and political entities of the period, as well as how they challenge ideas of race and femininity. Charlene's work is motivated by her personal and professional experiences, particularly her work with individuals and families impacted by domestic violence and incarceration. And these experiences continue to fuel her passion for her work today. Nathan Stevens is an associate professor of social work at Illinois State University. His bachelor's and master's degree in social work are from Columbia College at the University of Missouri. He is a PhD candidate at Mizzou, where his research utilizes critical race theory to examine the impact of racialized stress, racial trauma, and complex trauma among Black men and boys. Professor Stevens teaches social justice with diverse populations, generalist practice 3, social work with groups, and professional practice. Previously, he taught working with minority youth, social welfare policy, and race and ethnicity at Mizzou, the University of Illinois, and William Woods University, believing that education can change lives. Professor Stevens created and taught the course Social Justice and Social Work to students residing in the Danville Correctional Center for the Education Justice Project at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. Nathan is certified as a social justice educator and has presented at several conferences across the US, including the American Educational Researchers Association, the Big 12 Conference on Black Student Government, and the Association of Black Cultural Centers, to name a few. He has also presented to Fortune 500 companies like State Farm Insurance and Yahoo Verizon. Nathan has collaborated with government leaders by presenting to Missouri Legislative Black Caucus. He has also facilitated cultural competency training with the Southern Illinois University Carbondale Department of Public Safety, Bolingbrook Police Department, and Lincoln's Challenge Academy. His training also includes the Veterans Administration Hospital's Human Resources Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Equal Employment Opportunities. And Dr. Michael Schlosser is the director of the University of Illinois Police Training Institute. He holds a master's degree in public administration from Governor State University, a master's degree in legal studies from the University of Illinois, and a PhD in education from the University of Illinois. Dr. Schlosser is credited for his groundbreaking efforts toward police reform. Dr. Schlosser implemented additional innovative curriculum for improving the police practice that is not required by the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board. These courses include policing in a multiracial society, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questionable ally training, understanding victims of sexual assaults, police office wellness, and wrongful convictions. Dr. Schlosser's vision and foresight of police reform, including these additional courses, were implemented pre-Ferguson. Post-Ferguson brought about many recommended and required courses for police training. So as you can see, they've done a lot of amazing work. And our moderator, Rebecca Ginsburg, is Director of Education Justice Project, a comprehensive college and prison program that provides academic programs to incarcerated individuals and outreach services to families of incarcerated people, returning citizens. And I don't think I introduced myself. I am Jessica Ballard. I am the Archivist of Multicultural Collections and Services at the University of Illinois at the Champaign-Urbana campus. And a big thank you to Sarah Christensen for all her work for bringing us together. So, and thank you so much to the panelists for taking time out of your weekend to discuss with us. So I will stop talking and hand things off to our moderator.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you again to the panelists for being here. We've had a bit of discussion to prepare for today, and I let you know in advance the first question. In consideration of the fact that this is READ, and we are sponsored by the various libraries across the community, I told you that I would follow tradition and ask you to start by telling us, what are you reading right now? Especially, what are you reading right now that relates to our topics of race, criminal justice, and incarceration? Charlene, can I start with you?
Sure, can you hear me? Fantastic. Okay, so what am I reading? I'm reading tons of things, of course. But as a historian, in terms of, secondary sources, I'm reading the awesome work, as usual, of folks like Khalil Muhammad and the Criminalization of Blackness. But my work focuses specifically on the experiences of Black women who find themselves in carceral spaces. And so scholars such as Talitha LaFloria, Kali Gross, Cheryl D. Hicks, LaShawn Harris, those are the folks who I am tapping into to explore, and of course, Saidiya Hartman. I cannot go without mentioning Saidiya Hartman, to tackle these, the intricacies or the intimacies of Black women's experiences behind the wall, but also before they find themselves there. But I'm also reading primary sources. Oftentimes it's very difficult to identify the voices of incarcerated Black women, particularly in the 19th century or at the turn of the 20th. And my job, I view it as my calling, so to speak, to uncover those voices as much as I can. To illuminate the silences, the dark spaces that we find in the archive that keep their narratives silent and keep their narratives, that they prohibit us from being able to make connections to the contemporary experiences of women who are incarcerated or who are formerly incarcerated.
Thanks, Charlene. And I want to remind our panelists that I'm going to encourage us to actually speak up, ask questions of one another, interrupt if you get excited, so that we can have a conversation that's vibrant and hopefully helpful to people who are listening in. Charlene, if there's a book that you're finding particularly, or have found particularly impactful, enlightening, stimulating, can you put it in the chat, please? We were able to get that wonderful reading list. And Jessica and Sarah, I want to congratulate you. That's a wonderful reading list that you put together for today's episode. But if we can give a shout out to any books that are even that we want to highlight, let's just put them in the chat so the readers are, so the listeners are aware. Nathan, how about you? What are you reading? We can't hear you right now. I think you're on mute.
The books that I recommend is The Man Not by Dr. Tommy Curry. And as you can see from the cover, it starts off talking about George Floyd Jr., who is the youngest person ever sentenced to death and executed in the United States at 14 years old in South Carolina, I believe it was. And so kind of, echoing the notion of Emmett Till and a lot of the things that had happened, and going back to what Dr. Fletcher said, the criminalization of Blackness during a time period in which all a young man, young boy at 14 had to do was whistle at a white girl, and the other one is My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. And it talks about racialized stress and trauma and pathways to healing our bodies. And it situates Black bodies, white bodies, and police bodies. And it talks about the experiences of trauma and racial trauma specifically amongst those different groups and demographics. And it shares some opportunities to mitigate some of the stress and trauma that is stored within our bodies. And one of the most unique stories that Resmaa shares is it was a situation where a police officer was chasing a citizen that was on a motorcycle, and the motorcycle guy pulls over, turns the motorcycle off, and sits sideways with his hands up, and the police officer gets out of the car, runs up, and shoots him. And ironically, they were both two white individuals. And the guy said, "Man, I stopped, my bike's off, why'd you shoot me?" And the officer said, "I don't know." But Resmaa argues that a lot of times it's that, that fight, flight, freeze reflex, that survival brain that is going on. And so a lot of times when our officers are engaged in, a pursuit and that adrenaline is running, and a lot of times keeping in mind, I was doing some research for this, and it said police officers on average experience 14 to 20 traumatic experiences a year, right? And so those things that just really kind of mess with the mind, right? And so, but they don't do a good job of metabolizing that trauma. And so it's just stored up. And so incidents like that happen. And then conversely, as a Black man, a lot of times when I see if I'm behind a police officer, I'm nervous. And if I think the likelihood that I won't survive the encounter, my instinct is going to be to run. And so, as a young man, I remember being pulled over by a police officer, and he said, "Why'd you run?" And I said, "Because, I knew you were going to chase me. I knew you had some intent towards me, but I also knew I was innocent. I knew I was innocent, and I didn't trust that you would find me innocent. So I ran, And so, but Resmaa talks about mitigating some of that experience, some of those fears, some of those phobias that we have stored up bodily. And he says that we have to be intentional about getting that out of our system. And so he also goes back historically talking about, the medieval times where, trauma and stuff occurred even then amongst all white populations, and it moved across the Atlantic into the United States. But it's a really good read. It's really deep. But what I really like is he also gives us some breathing exercises and other things as a social worker to help us mitigate some of that trauma.
Nathan, you said it's okay to interrupt and have a conversation. That's kind of the idea today, right? So as you're talking, Nathan, I'm thinking, yeah, I mean, I'm a retired police officer, and I work at a police academy now. And I also teach a lot about, assumptions, biases, stereotypes, and we can talk about this. So how much do we think that, with the adrenaline rush and with biases, we know there's still some explicit bias out there, right? But with the implicit bias or the stereotype of equating African Americans or Black, especially young men, with crime, with fear, and with danger, right? So this is something that, there's going to be several ways that I'm working on to try to change that, and that's very difficult. But I don't think we can talk about the adrenaline rush and those things and those situations that you're talking about with also talking about race. And is that, you guys kind of on board with that, or?
Yeah, I would agree with that to an extent, and just understanding that one, there's no absolutes, right? So there's not all police officers, not all any group. I just don't believe in absolutes. I believe in there's always going to be some anomalies on each tail of any distribution, right? And so, you know, I also own some of my bias, as you had mentioned, you know, as a formerly incarcerated person who did almost 6 years in prison myself. I was okay with what I did, right? You know, coming from a disadvantaged background, selling drugs, et cetera, you know, but what was interesting for me is once I let that kind of lifestyle go and I started doing things more positive, becoming a community organizer and those kind of things, what was interesting is that my fear actually increased, right? I was more afraid of, you know, my political activities and the activities, the responses of law enforcement from that than I was from when I was selling drugs. And that's kind of this interesting paradigm. But I think part of it for me is I knew, you know, as a low-level drug dealer, you know, get me off the street, no big deal. But if I'm able to connect with power, right, then that might be something different. And again, so, but some of that was, I think, again, my past experience bleeding over into who I am currently. But I also think it's important to note that, you know, again, if we look at the statistics and things that are going on now, you know, these things are not accidental. I pulled up some records for the state of Illinois, and for Champaign County, the latest record showed that 56.55% of the inmates in Champaign County were Black, right? But the Champaign County is only 13% Black.
So you know what? I want us to get to that.
Okay, I'll wait.
I'm glad we're moving in.
I'll wait.
Just remind Nathan and Charlene.
I'll wait. So, but
Yeah.
but the point I was making with the statistics is that you know, we are aware of these inequities, right? And so if I'm pulled over and I'm aware of these inequities, then I know that you know, again, what's my gamble here? And especially, and I think about the case in I believe it was North Carolina, the guy who was on probation or parole, he was driving without a license and he jumped out and started running and got shot in the back and killed. James Scott, I believe was his name. And I empathize with that because I said, I can imagine if I was on probation or parole, you know, the likelihood that you're going to give me a break, you know, even if I'm just trying to go to work and come back. And so, you know, versus if I was white, would I have been given a break if I'm just going to work? And so these things kind of play out in terms of the narrative that we see playing out in our society.
Yeah, and I think
you want to step in here because I actually want to frame this before we jump into it.
all right,
And
I'll step back a little bit.
I want to start by inviting people to tell us what you're reading, share the titles in the chat.
All right.
Let's give Michael a chance to talk about what he's reading, and then I want to frame the discussion that we've already jumped into.
Okay.
Mike, what are you reading?
What am I reading? You guys remember Richie Rich, the little comic? No, I'm just kidding. So I actually, I read a lot, obviously having to do with things with the intersection of police and race. But I've been, over the years, I've been trying to find more and more about just, you know, racism in general and the inequities we have. And even though we've had the, you know, the civil rights era, the Brown v. Board of Education and all these different things, why is it that we are still so segregated today? And why is it that there's inequities in education and opportunities and things like this? And how did we get here and how do we get out? And it's not an easy to get out. But one of my favorite ones here is, a lot of you are familiar with this, The Color of Law, right? And I think most of you are familiar with that. But this is a good read, and historically it tells you a lot of stuff, and it's just, and I'm on my second time through it because there's so much good stuff there. Another one, couple that I really like, and The Hidden Rules of Race. Okay, so got that one. And anybody heard of this one? White Rage.
Yeah.
Excellent read. And then when it comes to some of these are a little bit older, and I've got some new ones coming in, but a couple that really have to do with maybe the history of a little more about criminal justice and the intersection of police and race. And this one actually came out right after, to show you how old I am, right after the Rodney King incident. And this is Skolnick and Fife have a lot of good stuff out there. and whether it's their scholarly work, articles in journals, but this book here, Above the Law. I recommend reading that. I've learned a lot from that. And then of course there's the famous Samuel Walker in Popular Justice. So a lot of what I read has to do with the kind of the cop stuff and what's going on and the culture of policing and the history of that, but also just the history and the politics of our country and why we are racism still exists today. It looks different, it's a little more implicit, but then again, how do we get out of it? And I don't know the answer. So that's kind of where I'm at with my. I do read comics once. I'm just kidding.
Thank you very much. It was nice to get those titles. Again, if you could please put them in the chat so that I think Jessica or Sarah has offered to compile them and make them available afterwards. It'd be very much appreciated. So I wanted to just frame our conversation. The topic of today is the historical and continual marginalization of Black people in the criminal justice system. Historical and continual marginalization of Black people in the criminal justice system, which is a lot. I even want to offer that the word marginalization may not be strong enough to describe what we're looking at, but that's a question for discussion. Marginalization, it might be too soft. Perhaps I would be inclined to call it discrimination and oppression. But the point that I think we want to get into and dig into is why is it that race, the race of a person is a determining factor in how they will be treated within the American criminal justice system. And we're particularly interested, for purposes of our discussion, in Black people. At least that's what we were given. That's what we were handed. I don't think anybody's going to object if we start talking about LGBTQ issues or Latinx issues, but we were handed the question of Black folks. So I want to spell that out, what I understand. One way that I, in my teaching, help students to understand what it means to be for Black people to have been historically marginalized or historically disadvantaged or historically discriminated against with respect to the criminal justice system. Because often I find that my students think it just means, yeah, Black people have it rough, or Black people commit more crimes, or, they're very reductionist. And it's important to understand that there is no criminal justice system, right? There are many criminal justice systems. Criminal justice is a state matter within the United States. Each state has its own criminal justice system. There's a federal criminal justice system as well. But these are diverse and varied criminal justice systems. And there's no one path through the criminal justice system. Anybody's engagement with the criminal justice system consists of many different steps, many different stages. And at each step and at each stage, some actor or group of actors gets to decide whether or not a person's going to stay engaged in the criminal justice system or be sort of shuffled on their way, given a warning or told to try again, given a second chance. And there's so much research that demonstrates that at each of these steps, Black people comparably situated with respect to white people fare less well with respect to these discretionary choices. That, for example, neighbors more likely to call on suspicious activity. The activity might be the same when Black folks are involved than when white folks are involved. Police more likely to come if Black folks are involved than if white folks are involved. Police more likely to arrest if Black folks are involved than if white folks are involved. At each step in the process, until we get to sentencing for similar activities, comparable activities, judges more likely to give harsher sentences to Black defendants than to white defendants. So from concerned neighbors to judges to prosecutors to police, various actors who compose the criminal justice system choose, and again, we're speaking statistically now, overwhelmingly in the United States, historically and today, choose to be more severe, less understanding, more punitive with respect to Black people than to white people. So there's no, Mike said something like, we don't know the solution. Of course, we don't know the solution. This is a vast and complex problem, but underpinned by some fundamental stuff, I think, that we hopefully will get to. And I want to ask you now, tell us about your work. Tell us about your projects and how they connect with what I've just described as the apparatus, the mechanisms by which Black people are discriminated against, are marginalized with respect to the criminal justice system of the United States today or historically. And Charlene, I spoke more than I thought I was going to, but I'm ready to hand it over to you again.
Okay, no problem. So again, I am a 19th century historian, 19th century US historian, and I focus on the confinement or the multiplicity of confinement of Black women. And by multiplicity of confinement, we talk about the criminal justice system, and a lot of times, particularly historians, we tend to focus on incarceration and that physical captivity behind the wall. And so my work takes a step back and looks at the conditions of confinement, or what I call socially constructed forms of confinement, that led Black women to make choices that directed them to the penal system. So, for example, in the late 19th century, domestic violence, which is something we still see in the 21st century, Black women may have made decisions that led to violence, reactive violence toward the perpetrator, which in turn led them to incarceration. I look at domestic labor as a form of confinement. In the late 19th century, of course, yes, enslavement is over, so to speak, but you still have Black folks who find themselves working in the homes of white families, but you also have Black folks who are working or who find themselves in the carceral sphere because of convict police and convict labor. Black women in particular, of course, they find themselves in domestic labor positions, which confines them economically. They have to be able to negotiate their wages, negotiate their labor. They may have, been discriminated against, not a may have, we know they were discriminated against in terms of the employer seeking to terminate contracts, which of course violates vagrancy laws because they're unemployed and then they find themselves in the carceral sphere. But I'm looking at the ways in which these everyday decisions led them to carceral spaces. Why Black women? Because we don't talk about Black women. A lot of times when we examine the state of affairs around African Americans and criminal justice, it's a very masculine-led discussion. We consistently talk about Black men. And then we speak about Black women as an afterthought. I give the contemporary example of the dearly beloved sister Breonna Taylor, who was murdered in March in Louisville, Kentucky, but we didn't know her name. We didn't speak her name until the world was rattled by the death of Brother George Floyd. And so I say that, I bring up that example because, Breonna Taylor's case has gotten a lot, it's still getting attention. But she, like many other Black women who find themselves dealing with the criminal justice system or who are murdered by agents of the criminal justice system, we don't often hear their stories. And so with that being said, my work focuses on Black women. I love Black men, love y'all, truly do. But I really want to amplify those voices, and not just those Black women who find themselves in the system, but the collateral consequences that Black women experience as well. Black men, Black fathers, Black sons, Black uncles, Black cousins, Black men who are incarcerated. There are Black women who are feeling the repercussions, the consequences of that, even though they may not find themselves behind the wall with their loved ones.
Thanks, Charlene. You used a term that comes up a lot, and I think it might be worth spelling it out a bit. Collateral consequences of incarceration. Could you just spell that out a bit more for us, please?
Absolutely. Usually when we talk about collateral consequences, we're looking at some sort of legal apparatus that prohibits formerly incarcerated folks from being able to have a smooth transition into society. So for example, depending upon a state, because like you said, we have diverse criminal justice systems. What's a felony in New York may not be a felony in Illinois. Conditions of parole or probation in New York may not be the same in Illinois. So some of those legal hindrances could be prohibiting someone from gaining a driver's license, or prohibiting someone from gaining a cosmetology license, even though they have tons of experience with cosmetology behind the wall. Various curfew restrictions that prohibit them from taking certain types of employment that could actually provide a livable wage. But I extend the definition of collateral consequences, just like I extend the definition of confinement, to encompass so much more than that. Because yes, there are legal statutes that prohibit folks from being able to have a smooth transition. Oh, forgot about this one. There's housing laws that say, if you committed a felony offense, then you are not allowed in public housing. If you've committed a drug offense, you're not entitled to Pell Grants to further your education. All of these things block someone from being able to fully access the means to be able to have that successful transition. I expand that definition because it's not just a legal apparatus, it's a societal apparatus. The stigma that we place as a society on folks who have been involved with the criminal justice system, just that stigma alone is also a collateral consequence. Yes, there are programs where business owners are encouraged with tax breaks to hire folks who have spent time behind the wall, but that whole idea of working with someone who's formerly incarcerated and that stigma that comes along with it, that's a collateral consequence. When we incarcerate folks in prisons are typically not in urban spaces. They're far out in rural spaces. And I give the example of places in New York where approximately 80% of New York's prison population comes from New York City. But the vast majority of prisons are upstate New York, 6, 7, 8-hour drive. So you're straining family relationships. You're straining family relationships because of the distance. Maybe that family does not necessarily have the resources to consistently visit. You break down those relationships. Those too are collateral consequences. So it's not just this legal apparatus or the state imposing new restrictions, but it's also these physical, these emotional, these psychological barriers that put this strain on families who find themselves involved with the criminal justice system.
I would add to that, and I agree. But I used to work at Big Brothers Big Sisters prior to entering into higher education, and I was over a program called Amachi that dealt with children of incarcerated individuals, and we found at that time, and this was like 2006 or so, that children that had a parent that was incarcerated is 7 times more likely to find themselves incarcerated than children who did not. And so I totally agree that those collateral consequences reaching, and then, there's also the aspect that, and I like what you talk about, the psychological prison or Plato's cave, if you would, because one of the things that I personally had to deal with, and I had we call an OG that talked to me when I was locked up. He said that you can't ask a woman or your partner to be in here with you from the standpoint psychologically. So if she wants to go to college or she wants to go to California and, live her life or whatever, you have to allow her the freedom to do that and not be in here with you. Because he said you make her to stop growing. right? So she's in here with you psychologically. She's no longer growing, right? And then research is also showing that our children are showing up in school upset and having violent actors, and that having a parent incarcerated is one of the ACEs, or the alternative childhood experiences, right? And so you're absolutely right. And I just wanted to add that other piece with that collateral consequences. So it was absolutely.
I completely agree with you. And I want to say this very quickly. The other thing that I consistently advocate for, particularly where if I'm working with a community organization or if I'm working with my students, is the importance of language. And so language in and of itself enhances or perpetuates the stigma. And so, when we talked about this, how do we address the issues with the criminal justice system, the language alone, and I think that goes far beyond race, because once we, if you study criminology, there's a social learning theory. If you call a child stupid frequently, and you call the child stupid long enough, the child will believe that it's stupid. But it's the same when you're talking about the criminal justice system. I do my best to refer to not to use words such as inmate, ex-con, convict. That's not who you are. Mm-hmm. I use the terms formerly incarcerated or incarcerated people because it speaks to the experience and not the individual. If you constantly walk around saying to yourself, I'm an ex-con, I'm an ex-con, I'm an ex-con, it sticks with your, it changes the way that you think. And it's also easier to fall into those stigmas and to respond to those stigmas. I do the same with 19th century history. In the antebellum period, enslaved men and women, instead of using the term slaves. They're not slaves. They have the experience of enslavement, but these were brilliant people. And had they not been as brilliant and as resilient as they were, we wouldn't be here, right? We wouldn't be talking right now, And so it's the same when you're speaking of formerly incarcerated or those who are currently incarcerated. Mm-hmm. They are, in my 10 years of working in the correctional system or the penal system, because nothing's being corrected, these are mothers, they're fathers, they're sisters, they're clergy people, and they're having this experience of incarceration. And so that's what we need to focus on. You cannot, quote unquote, rehabilitate or habilitate someone if you perpetually lock them into these terms or into these stigmas.
And I'd be happy to invite a conversation on the very notion of rehabilitation down the line. It's a problematic and tricky term, I think, and we can go there if you like. But first, Nathan, since we've heard from you, I'm going to reverse the order a little bit and ask Mike if you can tell about what do you do? How does your work relate to the big question of race and criminal justice and policing?
Sure, I think that I take a little different overall approach. And so if I'm trying to reform and make it so there's not as many disparities and having to do with police and race and things like that, I look at it in a broader focus through my academy training. And by that, I think that we need to change the culture of policing, kind of a paradigm shift. Now, keep in mind, when we say the culture of policing, it's not the same everywhere. Different departments have different cultures. Different precincts have different cultures. Different shifts can have different cultures. And some are much better than others. And if I can train in my academy to help change that culture, that's great. But unfortunately, some of them will go back to certain agencies where with their field training and they'll try to fall into that culture. So we need to change the culture, but also a lot of the leadership. But there are a lot of good departments that are being very progressive, and I want to give them credit. But so here's kind of my overall philosophy. I need to not just address race. I need to address what policing is like. And I took over as director in 2012, and something that makes us a little different than a lot of academies around the state and around the United States is we are not paramilitary. We are not military. I'm not going to yell and scream at recruits and discipline everybody for this and yell at them and then at the end say, now go out and be nice to people. You know, I mean, it just doesn't work that way. So, you know, we base things on the adult learning model. And, we do a lot of scenario-based training. 40 hours is required by the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board. We do 84 hours of scenario-based training because you learn by doing. And, you know, probably 3/4 of that is learning how to talk to people. And I don't teach what's just called de-escalation training. I teach non-escalation and de-escalation training, because how you talk to somebody to begin with can keep things from escalating. And so I also brought in several other courses that aren't mandatory, and I think officers need to be exposed to these things. So, you know, I brought in an optional course on the LGBTQ ally training, and I also have somebody from Concordia University that's going to be coming in and developing a course on gender studies for my officers. That's something up and coming. And I have a wrongful conviction class. So I was taking a course in my at ISU or at U of I Springfield on wrongful convictions. And I learned so much. And I said, I've got to bring this into my academy. And so what we do is we talk a lot about best practices. How can we keep at least the police side, you know, we've got the police side and then you've got the courts and everything else, but what can we do on our part to make sure that we are doing the best job we can, that we don't get that tunnel vision, that we don't just assume it's this person and focus on them. And so we do the best practices. But I'm telling you, here's where it hits home for these young recruits. And on the usually ends up being a couple hours, but the last part of the program is we have an exoneree come in and speak, somebody that's been incarcerated for a crime they did not commit, and they were in there 20, 25 years, and to hear their story, to hear their experience, to hear how it affected everybody in their life. And when they come out and the things that were so new, it was like they were stuck in time. And it's just, and the exonerees I've had come in and speak, it's not like they're anti-police. They're like, we want you guys to be that group that does it right. And we get, it's actually, I'm getting chills thinking about it right now because it's very impactful. I'm also working with Sundiata Chadjua and Helen Neville, also Maria Valgoy from Governor State University, and actually I do some work with some people in anthropology. But so with Sundiata and Helen, we have a class, Policing in a Multiracial Society project. And it's an additional 9 hours of training. And it's beyond the regular classes. And we have, you know, we're looking at kind of like awareness, knowledge, and skills. We want people to be aware of, you know, first of all, own the fact that, yes, I do have certain assumptions and biases, and I need to own that. And what can we work on to try to reduce those? How can we learn about more knowledge about the intersection of police and race and, you know, microaggressions and all these different things? And then what skills can we use as officers so that we're less likely to make decisions, more likely to make decisions on behavior and not race? But one of the things that we're finding out of this is also a research project along with wrongful convictions, but we're not very far on that one yet. But one of the things we're finding is that a lot of the recruits are pretty high in their colorblind racial ideology, right? Sort of this, I'm colorblind. I know I don't see race. I know I'm a good person. Mom always taught me to be great. And you know, I get that. But if you think about our society and every life experience we have and how we categorize things in our head, because if we don't, you know, our head would explode. We have to have this certain way of organizing things. And so through social media, through TV, through all of our experiences, we start developing these certain, you know, ways of organizing things, and we get certain biases and assumptions. And so that's one of the projects that we're doing. But something else I added in a few years ago is in our scenario-based training, we have scenarios where officers are arriving on the scene and they're showing it, and another officer is using excessive force. And what are they going to do? How are they going to react? To actually get practice and experience at doing things, it's like, oh, this is what I need to do. I need to not only say, get off of his neck, I need to push him off of his neck, right? And, and that angered every cop I know. It was just absolutely ridiculous and sad. But so, we're trying to change the way we train people. We really emphasize the community policing and something called non-enforcement contacts, which is something that how I policed and got to know everybody in my community, and they got to know me as a person, not just an officer, right? Everybody called me Officer Mike. And so we just got to know each other. And the more you get to know people and them as a person, and they get to know you and realize, hey, this cop, he's not just a cop. He's a dad, he does things in the community. He goes to the youth center with his kids. He's coaching, he's a Cubs fan, a Bears fan. We just get to know people. And by knowing your community, when you're interacting with somebody and you know them as a person and treat them as a person, right? And then that's so important. So these are huge emphasis that we do at our academy. And I know I can talk a leg off a chair, so I'll settle down here a little bit.
Mike, we had a question from one of the audience members who wants to know if you can please tell us some of the scenarios that you go through in your training, in your scenario training.
All right, so out of the 84 hours, here's the first one. No, I'm just kidding. I'll just give you a handful. All right, so, we do things a little different. A lot of academies will have like, here's your week of law, here's your week of traffic, here's your week of this and your week of this. And then at the end, they do scenarios. It's like, wow, I just learned stuff for 13 weeks and now I do scenarios. So we have scenarios scattered throughout the entire academy where they're going to learn a little bit and practice, and it gets more complex and higher risk as we go along. But they may even have to practice the simple de-escalation skills on some of the early calls they go on, like maybe somebody called the police for a theft and that person is really mad because it took you an hour to get there. And so, we need to use de-escalation for the smaller things, but then we build up to, people that are in crisis, people that have, mental health issues or developmental disabilities. And, we have a lot of good training and trainers on how to kind of mimic those types of scenarios. And it may be a suicidal subject. It may be somebody that has somebody as a hostage. It may be somebody that's just loud and angry and yelling, and domestic disputes. When your officers go in on a domestic and people are yelling and screaming, we don't want them going in and just saying, hey, calm down, right? We want to get them separated. If I'm getting cussed at and I'm getting yelled at, I need to say things like, instead of yelling and cussing back and taking it personal, they're not mad at me, they're mad at the situation, right? So I need to say things like, hey, sir, I can see you're upset. I'd probably be upset too if the police were called and I'm here. I tell you what, if I just get an ID from you, find out who you are, I can get you on your way, or I can be out of here. And just how to calmly talk to people that are angry or in distress or in crisis. And, we need to realize that the police get called when things are at their worst, and good people have bad times, right? People have financial problems, that, they have relationship problems, and that's when we get called. But that doesn't mean that's a bad person. That's just a tough time in their lives, drugs and things like that. We need to keep that in mind and have that empathy for them. And because people aren't going to call the police and say, hey, get the police over here. We're cooking out. Everything's great. So that's why it's up to the officers to get out of their cars, get out of that little box you're in and go start talking to people and getting to know people. And if they don't want to talk to you, try again tomorrow. They might just eventually get to know you as a person. So that's kind of our philosophy and the different types of scenarios that we do, if that answers the question.
It does. I have a question in response to follow up to that question, but also a little bit of a pushback respectfully, that I think that often police are called when things are really awful, when there's a mess, when there's a crisis, when there's crap happening. But there's lots of research to suggest police are often called when everything is fine.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the police have no business, and nobody has any business interfering. And I wonder if you ever do any scenarios that simulate those instances, and if any of the scenarios, given our topic, are particularly addressed to help the officers who I take it are primarily white, address their racial biases?
Well, one of the problems that we're having is that it's getting very difficult to recruit Black or Latinx role players, people of color. And I get it, right, during these times. And so that makes it tough. The people that are we have 150 part-time employees, and we train all of our role players just like we train the police on how to respond based on how the officer does it. But there's a lot of calls where the police officers and things aren't crazy as far as things aren't, and then I don't know if you were leading into, are there certain calls that maybe would be better served by non-police? I don't know if you were leaning that way as we're starting to talk about getting more and more social services involved with police agencies.
I guess I was speaking to particular instances that everybody knows about, like Tamir Rice. There shouldn't have been any police calls on Tamir Rice. And referring back to the way I laid out the conversation, which is that engagement with the criminal justice system often starts when somebody picks up the phone and calls the police, and white people are more likely to call the police in the first place at suspicious activity when Black people are involved and white people are involved, and often the activity isn't suspicious at all. So that's what I was referring back to. But I was also just curious from the scenario training whether any of the scenarios explicitly provide opportunity for the recruits to address racism, their own racism, implicit bias.
That would be mostly through like our video scenarios. Yeah, I mean, we can analyze videos, we can watch different things and different use of force incidents and just different interactions, and if you think about Sandra Bland, everybody's familiar with Sandra Bland, right? So if you think about that scenario and you look at that officer and the way we train and watching that officer is the one totally responsible. Nobody but him. He somehow got angry. He took things personal. Race very well could have been an issue in that. We agree with that too. But it's like, it's just like, so if you don't take things personal, and I feel like part of that was, it seemed like he got mad, especially because she wouldn't put out her cigarette. Did you guys kind of get that feeling? And I'm like, dude, let her smoke her freaking cigarette, write her warning ticket for her equipment violation, and let her be on her way. And he escalated that, and then he made that arrest. And I think she'd be alive today had he done his job the right way. And I had the opportunity to meet Sharon Cooper, the sister, and I was on a panel discussion with her. And I talked to her quite a bit about how we do our training for vehicle stops and things like that, and the de-escalation. And I asked her if I could mention it at the panel discussion because I had just analyzed that video with the recruits that day. Her goal is for police officers to do the job the right way. And I was really impressed with her. And she got me a little spot on Al Jazeera, so that was kind of cool.
Mike, I've just received a prompt that we're ending at 5, and my calendar invite goes to 5:30. Is everybody aware that we're going to 5:30 to 5? Okay, then I want to make sure that Charlene has a chance to respond because we're talking about Black women, but I also want to know more about what Nathan's doing. So, maybe Nathan, let's give it to you. I'm so sorry.
Real quickly, I had a couple of thoughts with Mike in terms of, I was watching the video kind of in preparation for this, and one of the sheriff deputies in Florida talked about emotional intelligence being incorporated into their training. And then I do what I call intercultural conflict competence, right? Which is what I hear in terms of with the Sandra Bland situation. How do you help officers understand what is your expectation of not only a Black person, but a Black woman? So you should be double subjective to what I say because I'm the authority, blah, 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 right? And so that speaks to some things. And then me being kind of funny, or at least I think I am at times, when I hear hear you say officers come in talking about they're colorblind. Well, how can you be a police officer to give somebody a ticket for running a red light if you're colorblind? I mean, I'm just saying, but
no, and I think maybe Nathan, some of the stuff you're talking about, maybe you and I should chat separate and bring it in. But I am working with somebody from Yale College of Medicine and somebody as police psychologist in California right now on this emotional intelligence and how I can bring it into PTI. And they're way smarter than me, so and you are too. So we just got to hook up sometime.
But what I'm working on is actually submitting a proposal that uses my grandmother's hand in a learning lab to where I have a diverse group of students and some community folks and police officers who come together. We read the book, we watch videos. When we have some conversations about some of the headlines and the topics that are popping up in the headlines, for example, the Amy Cooper scenario is very, very poignant. And one of the things that I hope folks like Mike are taking into consideration when they're training officers is that there has to be some culpability on the callers, because she said very specifically, I will tell them that basically I'm a white woman and I know the stereotypes, biases, and assumptions that comes with law enforcement. And so I'm going to tell them that I'm a white woman being threatened by a black man in Central Park. And it's suggested that I know how they're going to come, right? Like the cavalry, so to speak. And so I'm hoping that law enforcement, as well as society itself, is having some punitive consequences to kind of dissuade that. But I'm hoping to kind of have some conversation in a learning lab contest. So I'm writing a grant proposal to do that and to offer some incentives for participation. That's it.
My daughter bought me this recently.
I want Charlene. We're talking about Black women here.
Of course. I completely agree with both Mike and Nathan. I think that in the case of Sandra Bland, you're absolutely right. Issue the ticket and move on. But because there is this belief, that Black people are inherently violent, or we are this, or we are that, it causes people to respond in particular ways. Black women are often viewed as the angry Black woman, or resistant, or defiant. It makes me think of, not to bring politics into this, but the vice presidential debate and Kamala Harris's engagement on the stage. Folks were saying she could have done more, but she had to hold back because there's this belief that Black women are combative from jump. And so when you enter into situations with those biases up front, you're going to have outcomes such as Sandra Bland's. It's unfortunate, but that's what's happening. But I like the idea of the intercultural conflict training. Nathan, what you're doing sounds amazing. So I'd like to talk to you more about that, and Mike, definitely your the scenarios that you're doing with your recruits. The other thing that I think, and not just with regard to Black women, but white women, and well, anybody who's making these phone calls, you are literally weaponizing law enforcement. And so that in and of itself, there's that element of privilege. I'm going to call, and like you said, Nathan, the cavalry is coming, but you're calling with the expectation that the police will show up and do something. And we all know that the do something is not, just pat the guy on the back or pat the woman on the back and let her go on her way. So this idea of weaponizing the police, and I guess that's actually a question I have for Mike. How do you respond, and how do you educate your cadets or your recruits, excuse me, in that vein, because that's literally what's happening. Amy Cooper, I read last week that she actually made 2 calls and she's being prosecuted for both. The first, where she said, you know, he's threatening me. She apparently called a second time and said, you know, he actually assaulted me. So you've made 2 phone calls, you know, false reports as it is, but it's like you escalate your claims in an attempt to escalate the response from law enforcement. And so since I've only had, you know, police training with regards to domestic violence, but how do you engage the recruits just in dealing with that public perception?
And you've got 1 minute, Mike. Sorry.
Okay, 1 minute. Here we go. So we do show that video, right? Okay. That was like a TV laugh, right? But we also have them understand that the initial dispatch is a portion of the call. You know, what was the call? What do I observe when I get there? What's going on? I'm interacting with people, and it's, you know, you have to base everything on the totality of the circumstances as it evolves throughout the call. So, that was my supersonic speed, but I won't go into my rap god with Eminem. Some of you have heard that before, so.
Well, it's obvious that the topic of race, policing, and criminal justice needs more than an hour, because we've just started to brush the surface. My apologies for misunderstanding the time we had allocated to us. Jessica and Sarah, should we be wrapping up now and thanking our participants and the audience and you and Reed for providing an opportunity for us to connect? I'm really delighted that so many of the panelists look like they're going to have these other connections afterwards and follow up the conversations. Thank you for joining us. Jessica, should I give it back to you?
Sure. And I just want to make sure if anyone has any really burning questions, we can probably take 1 or 2, because I definitely don't want to take away from anything that anyone really wants to ask.
Could we do a part 2? This is fun.
Well, yeah, we could schedule a part 2, right?
Yeah,
it could be like a whole series, like Rocky 1, Rocky 2, Rocky 3.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't object. And yeah, there's someone in the chat that said please. And yeah, I just want to say thank you so much to all of you for giving some of your time up this weekend. I feel like I could easily hear you all go for another 90 minutes and would still want to hear more. So just really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And we'll have more information about future events.
And it worked out well because my Bears aren't on until tomorrow night. So.
Thanks again to the panelists and to Reed for hosting this event. And
yes,
thanks for people showing up and caring about this.
All right, and we'll be in touch. And you don't know what I'm pointing at you guys, but yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
All righty. Signing off.
Bye. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.
You.
That was